Episode 3 of Studio Effects. I'm going to talk today about modulation. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean chorus, phasing, flanging, all sorts of other things like that. And I'm going to group them all together because there are similarities between them, but also some important differences. Now, for this, I'm going to need my Fender Rhodes electric piano, very unassuming sound. And then a not so unassuming Fender Telecaster to demonstrate some of the sort of versatility of these effects, really. Now, the Fender Rhodes in the late 70s had chorus added to it to give it a little bit more presence in the stereo mix. So if I have my Rhodes, which does this, I'm just going to select a chorus from the modulation banner. There we go, stereo chorus. Gives it a nice sort of washy edge around the stereo spectrum. Now, chorus is really, it comes from, well, it's a choir. If you've got lots of people singing the same line, that's a chorus. So you have essentially a unison line that is reproduced in such a way to make it sound like there's more than one player. That was the idea of it. I mean, it's not entirely realistic, but it's a lovely effect. Now, if I just turn up the intensity of this, basically what's going to happen is that the very slight pitch variations that exist in a chorus, essentially you've got copies of what comes in, slightly detuned and then added together. And then the rate of detuning is determined by this rate control here. That's almost a ring modulator. So, to take the intensity down a bit and the mix up, you can get a really warm sound. And of course, because it's stereo, it's panning these sort of pitch-shifted things in stereo. It turns a mono instrument, which was the Fender Rhodes, into more of a stereo one. Of course, the Fender Rhodes did have a panning control, which I'll go through as well. So, the Fender Rhodes works really nicely with chorus. Now, I'm going to go and pick my guitar up, and I'm going to play that same sound. So, stereo chorus. Just before I do that, I'm just going to bypass it and play you the guitar as it stands. So, the guitar is simply just plugged into the computer. There's no amp simulations or anything. Now with the chorus. Now, that's not as strong as some of those electric guitar choruses, so let's turn the intensity in the mix up a little bit. Now you're getting those sort of 80s guitar sounds like of Andy Summers, for example, for the Police. Or the beginning of Prince, beginning of Purple Rain. So that's a chorus pedal at the beginning of that tune. Now, moving on, I'm just going to select the flanger instead. Now, what this does, a little bit of history, that I'm just going to keep it mono as well. A little bit of history about this flanger, a tape flange, which is basically an empty, a tape reel, was you'd have two machines playing at the same time, playing exactly the same thing, whether it be a guitar solo or anything like that. And then you'd mix those two tape machines into a third tape recorder. And what you do is hold the flange down of one of them just to slow the tape recorder down ever so slightly and then release it again, and then you get this sort of weird difference between the two. The idea being that you'd slow one recorder down, then slow the other one down for the other one to catch up, and then repeat the process. So that is your rate control here, and I'm just going to open the page up a bit so that you can see it a bit bigger. So the rate is 1.133 hertz, 10-second period. So what I have here then with the guitar is a sort of gently sweeping effect whose rate is governed by that control there. Now we have this little feedback thing, which is like the carrier. Essentially, it's an amplified version of this signal here. You know, may not be a good effect. Stick it through some reverb, perhaps. That might sound quite good. It's all creativity. There's no right or wrong way to do this. Intensity is basically just how much of the effect there is. And of that pitch variation, and actually the intensity of the effect overall is the mix control. No effects there, and maximum effect there. It is quite similar to the chorus, hence the fact that it's in this same demonstration, but the process by which it was originally achieved is completely different. Lastly, we've got the phaser. I know there are other things here, but I'm just going to go through the main three. Now, a phaser is essentially what happens if you've got a signal like this going into the phaser. You have several versions of it that are very slightly out of phase, and then they're brought in and out of phase by another rate control. Here on this phaser, on Logic, we've got two low frequency oscillators, these. I'm just going to use one of them just so that you can hear the effect. It's quite cool with two though, because you can do quite a lot. On the left, we've got a control marked stages. That's essentially how many of the waves you've got going out of phase. So if I play your 12-stage phaser, there are many copies of it. If I go down to 4 stages, the sound is less intense because there's essentially fewer things that it's processing. If I go up to the 12 stage again, you have a ceiling and a floor. Now what this means is how far the thing cycles between, how fast that rate, or rather the extent at which that rate affects the overall sound. And the thinner the range, the thinner it sounds as a sort of an overall effect. Now you can set your rate up to actually be a note. So if you've got your, maybe if you've got your bar, for example, or yeah, 1 bar. So I think we're at 120. Essentially does the same thing every bar. So it's quite a nice little tool that just to make that sort of work in time for you. Now, if I introduce the other rate, if I make this one much higher, for example, you can have, you can make a sort of ghost sound. Feedback is the sort of general sort of wobbliness that you get. So it's making its own sound as well as processing the original. And then we have an overall sort of tone control. So it doesn't go too bassy or too far into the top end. You can vary that as well or switch it off. And the output level. And the plus 100 and minus 100 is essentially turning those rates upside down. So generally speaking, plus 100 and minus 100 are the same, but it depends on the rhythm. It depends on the rate that you've set, indeed, if you've set a particular note value at all. So there is a phaser. Now, I'm just going to close this demonstration by just talking about a couple of other things, because this kind of falls under the modulation banner as well. We have something called a Rotary Cabinet. Now, this is from a Hammond organ. As you can see, there's an old bit of furniture there. Inside that was a revolving bass speaker and then a faster revolving treble speaker, where actually there were 2, one of which was a dummy, just to keep the weight balance. And what this is essentially a cabinet that throws sound round a room. So it's a bit like a reverb in some sort of way. And there were 2 speeds. There was fast and slow, and that was it. But it took time to go from slow to fast. I've worked on the original ones of these, and it's all belts and pulleys and motors and slippage and all that. So it takes time to go from slow to fast, and that is synthesized here very well, I might add. There is also something called a scanner vibrato, which was actually part of the electronics of a Hammond organ, which is more of an electronic chorus effect. And it it was always that same rate. You can adjust the rate on here, but on the original Hammond organ, it was on or off. And then you have vibrato, which is varying the pitch. Nice. So if we have, just looking, one last thing, modulation, we've got the tremolo. I'm not going to look at spreader, that's different. Tremolo, this is basically how a Wurlitzer keyboard was able to make that sort of, that sound, but much faster. You can change the shape of the vibrato. At the moment, you've got this sort of sawtooth. You can actually change that completely, so you end up with something like that. And vary the depth of it as well. You can have more of a square wave if you want. Won't get fooled again. That's that keyboard bit at the end. Has that sort of effect on it. So there we are. We can actually also, if I just, one last thing, we can actually make it pan between the speakers if we choose a stereo version. And you can set the rate, of course. We can have the smoothing as well. Now that was a function of the Fender Rhodes. Really, I should have been playing this with the Fender Rhodes sound, because that was a major part design of the Fender 88 suitcase. I used to have one of those as well. It's just too heavy. So you have your Fender Rhodes that will dance around your stereo image. So there it is. There's a demo of some of those modulation effects. They all do quite different things, but you can see how they're all similar. They can all be grouped together because they change the sound with some sort of period, with some sort of low frequency oscillator included. Have fun, and remember, you don't have to do anything. You just play and have a blast.